Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Inclusive Teacher Co podcast with me, Steph Beatty. I'm an ex-English teacher turned neurodiversity trainer. I'm also a literacy specialist, an entrepreneur, and somebody who works with both educators and parents a lot of the time to make better sense of neurodivergence literacy and what support actually needs to look like in real life. So whether you are a teacher, a parent, a Senko, a support assistant, or somebody just trying to make sense of why a child is struggling in school, you are very welcome here. Now, today's episode is for teachers, but it's also for parents too. And it's going to probably make both groups feel a little bit uncomfortable because I need to say something out loud that definitely I didn't understand in my career much earlier on. Some children I thought were stupidly lazy. Okay, I've said it. I thought they were lazy. I'd got it wrong. I thought a lot of the time I was looking at poor effort, avoidance, kids who just couldn't be asked. But actually, in some cases, I was looking at children who were already struggling before they'd even gotten to the task itself. And I think we're still getting this wrong. We are still too quick to talk about effort and attitude without really understanding what reading demands are doing to some children, especially children with ADHD, and especially where ADHD sits alongside dyslexia or any other learning challenges. And this is one of the reasons why I do trainings on this for schools and separately for parents as well, because I think the misunderstanding is massive. So today I want to talk about reading and why I call it the passport skill, why it matters so much for kids with ADHD, and what I got wrong and what parents and educators need to do more to get on board with. Okay. And if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment or a review, and share it with somebody who needs it. So let's get into it. First of all, English is not just an English thing. One thing that does my head in a little bit is when reading gets treated just like it's an English problem. It absolutely isn't. Reading is the thing that gets you through school, full stop. And that's why I call it the passport skill, because you can be bright, you can be funny, curious, full of ideas, verbally strong, really switched on, but underperforming. Because if reading is shaky or slow or quite draining, that affects access to everything. So if you're a teacher listening to this and you're thinking reading is the English department's problem, then you really need to listen to this for sure. Think about it. You have word problems in maths. If you can't access the language, it's going to be tricky to solve. You've got science questions, history sources, geography case studies, instructions in exams, revision, homework, everything. Everything in life revolves reading. So when reading is weak, it's not just that English feels harder, school feels harder in general. And when you've got kids with ADHD, this is mattering even more, because if attention is inconsistent, if working memory is a bit all over the place, and that emotional dysregulation in the sense of frustration kicks in quickly, reason is not just one more classroom task, it's this constant barrier between the child and what they actually know. So you can end up with a very bright child who is underperforming when really they're burning loads and loads of mental energy just trying to get through the reading in the first place. And I think adults miss that all the time. So we look at what the child produces at the end, we make a judgment without thinking enough about what it's actually taken for them to get there. Now, let me be honest, I got this wrong. So very early on in my teaching career, I definitely got this wrong with some children, and I was very frustrated. Sometimes they wouldn't read, they wouldn't finish, they wouldn't get on with it, they wouldn't apply themselves. And you know what, guys? Teaching is freaking relentless, isn't it? All right, you've got 30 plus kids, your workload's insane, you've got behavior, marking, data, meetings, somebody asking for a glue stick or left-handed scissors, and you're thinking, I can't even afford this. You know, our budget doesn't stretch. Okay, but we don't always have time to stop and think deeply about what's underneath every struggle here. Sometimes we're just trying to get through the damn lesson. But when I had more time later on to properly learn about ADHD and more literacy challenges, and that was my job as head of whole school literacy, I realised that there were more children that I definitely misunderstood. And there was one boy I'll remember forever. I won't name him. He was year 7, so 11, 12 years old, reading age of about 6 or 7, according to the test that we give them. When he had to read independently, it was really hard going for him. He got stuck, he was slow, he didn't finish. And on paper, he looked miles behind. But when I read aloud and he tracked the text with his finger, okay, you could see straight away there was much more going on there than his written work has suggested. He could talk, he had ideas, he understood character, theme, inference, deduction. It was there, the reading skills were there, but the reading access wasn't. Okay, the thinking was there, the reading access wasn't. And he was also dyslexic and autistic and ADHD. Okay. But because his dyslexia wasn't officially diagnosed on paper till much later on, he didn't have the support that he should have had as intensively as he should have had earlier on in his primary school experience. So every time he was asked to read independently, he was already having to work super hard before he'd even got to the meaning of the text. And again, add ADHD into that mix, and the whole thing just becomes heavier, because it's not then just about the reading, it's attention, frustration, stamina, sustaining effort, and something you're really not interested in. It's a whole lot. Okay. So yes, I look back and I think there were times I was looking at the wrong problem. But let's think about what reading actually demands. And I think parents and teachers need to take stock of this, because reading can sometimes be oversimplified. It sounds simple to us as adults because, to be honest, like, we forget how much it actually involves. So we forget how we learned to read, or a lot of us, unless we had challenges with it, a lot of us actually have forgotten how much it actually involves. We have to decode, we have to remember things, we need language knowledge, we need to pay attention. It needs us to hold meaning together across a sentence, a paragraph, a page, a book, and that can be really, really difficult. And then on top of that, kids have to answer questions on it, analyse it, write about it, infer from it, all under timed conditions, timed pressure. So for a child with ADHD, if the reading isn't secure, or it's full of effort, or it's slow, the whole thing is going to feel exhausting really, really quickly. And sometimes we only see that outward bit, the fiddling, the avoiding, looking out the window. And for teachers, asking to go to the toilet the second the reading starts, which, you know what, let's be honest, is often suspiciously well timed. But underneath that, sometimes the child already knows that this is going to feel hard and they're trying to get out of it before that feeling kicks in. And that doesn't mean they don't care. Okay, but if we keep reading that as attitude, we're missing the point. And I think schools are massively underestimating how often ADHD and dyslexia can overlap. And when they do overlap, school can become a really, really exhausting place, because now the child isn't just trying to learn the content, they're trying to get through the way the content is actually being delivered. So, for example, if they're struggling already with attention, getting started on a task, and they're frustrated anyway, then the reading itself is too hard. You've got a kid who's being asked to fight on multiple fronts all day long. And we say things like, they need to focus, they just need to try harder, they just need to read more. But if reading already feels hard, draining, and embarrassing, that child is going to fling themselves away from it. They're hardly going to fling themselves towards it with joy, are they? And this is where both parents and teachers need to get more honest, because if a child repeatedly feels behind, feels slow, or I suppose vulnerable because they're exposed when they're reading, they're going to start protecting themselves. So again, it could be avoidance. It looks like behavior. They're shutting down. They could be being the class clown, so nobody notices they're stuck. Kids aren't daft. All right, they know when something makes them feel like shit. I don't apologise for swearing there either. I'm an English teacher by trade. I've proven myself, so there you go. Okay, they know when something makes them feel rubbish. Now, I didn't get it all wrong. There were things that I did do well. I scaffolded a lot. In fact, one of the comments I got earlier on in my career through observations was that my scaffolding was strong, but there wasn't enough independence. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, but children don't become independent because we suddenly remove all support and hope for the best. That's not magic. It's just unhelpful. Independence comes after enough supported practice that child can gradually hold more of the task on their own. That's very different. So I did pre-teach vocabulary. I did chunk text. I did read out aloud a lot. In fact, I used to play characters. Now, for those of you who back in the day used to teach of mice and men, and for you new teachers listening who don't teach this, you don't know what you're missing. But for those of us back in the day who did teach of mice and men, I used to literally read the characters of George and Lenny in the voices of what I envisaged to be George and Lenny. And for some reason, Lenny always took on a Southern American accent, and I don't know why. I think maybe the film influenced that. I'm not sure. But I did read out aloud a lot. I modelled constantly. I used movement constantly. And that is something I talk about a lot in my trainings, by the way. And it goes beyond movement. But yeah, movement breaks are great. Okay, they do a job, don't get me wrong. But we go beyond movement breaks in my trainings, let's just put it that way. But I used movement where I could. And I tried to build learning up in steps. And I stand by a lot of that. What I would question now is whether I always thought hard enough about cognitive load and volume. I always worked well with the kids who needed most support. And I always worked well with the kids who needed the least support but needed most stretch and challenge. But I think sometimes I confused more work with better work. And I think sometimes I never thought about the cognitive load and volume. And especially, I mean, I've just recently published a newsletter about this on LinkedIn. So please do connect with me, Stephanie Beatty, on there and subscribe. And I've also talked about the bright kids, not that, the children aren't bright at all, but are brighter kids who are super academic, who we often miss. And what's their cognitive load? Because they're bringing in more work or great work, we often don't ever see any underlying neurodivergent condition. But anyway, that is a whole different topic, I'm sure. But actually, what we need to think about is sometimes the child does show that they know more. Okay, they actually know more that they can exemplify, but the route we're making them take to prove it is so heavy that they never get a fair chance. And I think that's worth thinking about. And again, as I've said, the quiet kids get missed too. I also knew far less than I should have done about masking, especially in girls. And I do often reflect and I think, oh my God, like how many kids did I miss? Like, am I the worst teacher in the world? And I think back to these kids and I think, above all, are they happy and healthy? But I think, how many of them have I actually missed? Like, have I done a shit job as a teacher? But not every child is struggling in the most obvious way. Some kids are really loud and external about it, of course, but some are quiet. They're compliant, very people-pleasing. They copy and mimic. They see what their friends are doing and they keep their heads down. And they hold it together in school and get home, they lift their mask off and the parents say they have meltdowns at home. They absolutely fall apart in a place where their nervous system feels safe. And that's not because they're causing a scene, it's just because they're being missed. So when we talk about reading struggles and ADHD and overload, I think we need to be really careful not to picture the only child who's visibly bouncing off the walls. Sometimes the kids who are struggling the most are the ones who aren't saying anything, the ones who are trying really desperately not to be noticed. They're masking so well. They need the understanding too. And you know what? I'm not blaming anyone here. I'm not blaming teachers. And I want to be absolutely clear, I'm not blaming parents either, okay? I was a teacher. I know what the pressure is like. I know that we are in a recruitment crisis. I know what it's like to be stretched, to be tried, to be trying your best in a system that was not designed for the neurodivergent child at the center of it. Okay, it is very, very hard for these kids to thrive in an environment that was never initially designed for them. But I also think we have to be honest and say that teachers need better training on this, parents need better understanding, and schools need better conversations. Because if we're somehow expecting these kids with ADHD to suddenly mold themselves around a system neatly that doesn't really fit them, we'll keep deciding that they are the issue. And that's not the case. Sometimes it's the setup, it's the mismatch, it's the demand, okay? And that is a whole different conversation from this kid just needs to try harder or focus more. And for parents listening as well, I do get it. If school feels like a battle, I speak to parents constantly about this. In fact, we're just about to launch the ADHD Reading at Home program, and so check that out if you need more support. It's very affordable and very accessible for parents. Parents are constantly having to explain their child and defend their child, and it's bloody exhausting. But I do think the best conversations with schools are the more specific ones. So not just my child is struggling. What exactly does that look like? When does it happen? What does reading look like at home? What does avoidance look like? What helps and makes it worse? What practical adjustments could make a difference? And that gets you somewhere. And where possible, bring your child into that conversation. Depends on their age, of course. You know them better than I do. But bring them in on that conversation. They often know far more than us as adults. They know and they realize what feels hard, what's boring, what's embarrassing, what's overwhelming. So what would I change now? If I was back in the classroom now, knowing what I know now, I would be even more intentional about reading. I would think more carefully about access before the outcomes. I would use more engaging text, but I do like to say I do pride myself on using engaging text, but the reality is whoever's writing these exams, honestly, kids aren't interested in these topics seriously. Okay. But I would use more non-fiction linked to interests. I would think harder about task volume, and I would be much slower to assume avoidance means that the kid doesn't care, because we know that they care a lot. I'd ask myself better questions. Sometimes they care so much that they would rather avoid that task than feel stupid again. And that is a very, very different thing. And once reading opens up, so much more can open up with it. And that's why this conversation matters, not because every kid needs to become some sort of tiny book critic or bookworm, but just because if reading gets stronger, school gets more accessible, and it's going to change more than just educational outcomes. It changes a lot. So the bottom line for me is this: reading isn't a side issue. It's not just an English department concern. It is one of the biggest access points in education. Full frickin' stop. And when a kid's got ADHD alongside dyslexia or any other neurodivergent condition or any other literacy difficulties, we need to stop being so quick to frame it as laziness, bad attitude, or poor effort. Sometimes adults are looking at the wrong thing entirely, and parents need to understand this better, teachers need to understand this better, and schools need to take this more seriously. If reading is the thing that opens the door to the curriculum, we should be doing a lot more. We should care a great deal about the children still struggling to get through that damn door, still struggling to obtain that passport to access. And another hill I'm going to die on, I'm sure. So if this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to the Inclusive Teacher Co podcast, leave a comment, share it with somebody else who needs to hear it. That's the only way that I am going to get the message out there, as if you guys advocate as well. If you're a parent or a school or an organization looking for training on neurodiversity, literacy, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and what it looks like in practice, that is exactly the kind of work I do through Inclusive Teacher Co. Thank you for listening, guys. I really appreciate it. And I will see you in another couple of weeks for the next episode.